joining us today. My name is Bill Young. I'm here with my daughter, Dr. Dustin Young. And what we're going to talk about today is twofold. What I'm going to share with you over the course of the next 20 minutes or so is the personal journey of how I went into the most severe case of anxiety that I've ever felt, and some of the things that happened to me, and then how I began to come out of that. And then Dustin, who is an expert in suicide prevention, as well as she is a professor in the social work department at Andrews University, is going to share some strategies so that we can identify these things in ourselves as well as within our friends and our family, as well as some things that you can do as far as things to go along that way. But before we start, let's open with prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your love, your kindness, your gratefulness. We ask now that you will be here with us as we talk about this really, really sensitive yet very, very important topic of how not to die from mental illness. We love you so much, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. As most everybody knows, about 5 years or so ago, the kidney that Verly had given me about 23 years prior to that began to fail. And that in and of itself was a miracle, because my physician said transplanted kidneys normally last between 10 to 12 years in time. And here I had this kidney for 22 years, and it began to fail. Now, we suspect that it probably began to fail as a result of a motorcycle wreck I had over in North Carolina about a year earlier. But I went on dialysis and began to struggle with dialysis. It was just terrible. I went to the hospital at least 3 times thinking that I was having a stroke, because after dialysis, I would have these severe incapacitating headaches that would come on suddenly and were indicative of having, basically, you got a blood vessel that burst in your brain. So that kind of set me up for all of this. One of the things to keep in mind is that I've struggled with depression all of my life. When I was 21 years old, I can remember I was a student down at what was then Cumberland College, and I had been up here in Lexington for a fire school. I was working with a volunteer fire department down there, and we were up here at Lexington, and I was coming back, and I was just all of a sudden, suddenly just overwhelmed with this sadness that I'd never experienced before. I didn't know why it was. And my first thought was I attributed it to the fact that I was not living the life as a Christian at that point in time. And my thought was, God's mad at me, and this is what's going on. And I struggled with that again. And I've struggled with depression all of my life. But typically, I will have a depressive episode. It'll last for a couple of weeks, and then it goes away. There's certain things that I know that will help to bring that on. Right now, I'm struggling with a head cold that we picked up off of a vacation, and I've got a really, really bad cough. When I take decongestants and cough syrup, that has a tendency to make me become depressed. So we're kind of watching that right now. But as I went through life, I remember having one episode of anxiety when Dustin was probably about 6 or 7 years old. It lasted for 2 weeks. It went away. I never experienced it again. After the kidney transplant, as you went through this journey with me as well. We were still over in the other place. Daisha from Garden Springs, Kansas, gave me the kidney. It started working immediately. My numbers just plummeted and came back to normal. Everything was working, and I went back to teaching. I actually went back to teaching about 3 weeks before I was supposed to, because y'all know me. I went to one doctor, and he said, no, you can't drive. So at my next visit, I went to another doctor and said, hey, can I go? She said, yeah, how do you feel? Okay. So we played the mama and daddy thing, even in medicine. So I went back to work about 3 weeks before I was supposed to, which was probably a good thing. Shortly thereafter, I began to recognize and start having these feelings of fear. And Chandra, the biggest fear that I had was I'm going to lose everything and my wife and I are going to become homeless. That was the thing that worried me beyond everything else. There was no basis to that fear. Okay, I had a good solid job. You work for a public university, you're always worried about what your numbers are and whether they're going to cut your program and rumors that you hear. But there was no basis for that. Here's the problem. It just began to escalate and get worse and worse and worse. Just before, well, as we were going through this, I was still teaching. I was going into class. But Rachel, I wasn't a good teacher. I would cancel class because I couldn't get out of bed. I was afraid, okay? And, you know, Judy, even when I was in class, it was kind of like, okay, let me give them a little bit of information and then just dismiss them and let them go. So these kids got shortchanged on what they were paying for their education. So much to the point that this class that I'm talking about, when they finished up with their studies and everything, at the very end, they have to take two tests. They have to take a written test and they have to take a practical test. Now, we already know the things that are going to be tested on the practical test for their national license. So we don't know the scenarios, but we know, and it's just basically a formality, okay? We went into this testing part. I had 19 students. Of 19 students, 17 of them failed. And they were furious at me. And rightfully so, Robert. You know, I sat there on the day of testing, and I had just one student call me everything in the book. And I couldn't rebuke him because he was right. I had failed them as a teacher. You would think that that was probably the lowest point in that progression. No, it's about to get worse. So as we're moving on and going into this, y'all may remember a little thing that happened. It was in all the newspaper called COVID. COVID was kind of a two-edged sword for me because when we got really into the throes of COVID, obviously everything shut down. We had to move all of our classes online, which means I didn't have to go to the university anymore, okay? I was very, very quickly getting to the point of where I wouldn't even go outside of the house. So I was teaching classes online, doing a fairly decent job again because I didn't have to go into class. But there were times, and again, this incessant fear, and it was just overwhelming. I'm going to lose my job. Verly and I are going to be homeless. I have to take care of Verly, and I'm not going to be able to. And that just continued to multiply and multiply and multiply. Now, at that time, I was working with a counselor. This counselor I think she was a good counselor, but I wasn't getting any better. And somewhere in the middle of that, thanks to our federal government, one of the things that happens when you go on renal failure is you qualify for Medicare. Now, obviously, I'm 66 now, but I wasn't qualifying for Medicare at that point in time. But I'd had Medicare while I was on dialysis, and I had it for, a year and a half afterwards or so for my medicine. Well, Medicare comes back in and says, you owe us X number of dollars, which I think was like $4,000. It was a large amount because I had not paid the premium. That's the word. Thank you. Well, here's the problem. When we signed up on Medicare, the second time, we had given them our new address. We worked with a social worker at the dialysis department, And we had the documentation that we had given them the new address. But guess what? They were sending our premium notices to the Georgia address that we had not lived at for over 10 years. And that's why it wasn't being paid. The problem with this is now Medicare comes in and says you have to pay. And the other thing that comes in is now my insurance says, oh, you're eligible for Medicare? Well, we're not going to pay for your mental health. Okay, so now here I'm stuck. I'm holding on by a strand with a counselor I think that is helping me. I come to find out later this counselor wasn't as beneficial as I thought. Not anything with her, but it was more with me. And now I'm in this limbo of, now what am I going to do? Okay, again, God worked through all of this in the fact that I was supposed to go to Lexington to work with Social Security, and I had done that before, and it was terrible. Huge, huge bureaucracy. And Verly said, well, why don't you go to the Social Security office over here in Danville, see what will happen. I got someone, a government worker, a federal government worker that I suspect was much like you, Robert, who was compassionate and concerned about me as a person. And I explained to her what was going on, and she literally wrote up a handwritten note, and she said, is this what you're telling me that's going on? And I said, yeah, that's perfect. That's it. She said, would you sign that? I said, yeah, I'll be happy to. I signed it, and instantly things got better. The Medicare payments were starting back up. They would let me make like $200 a month payment on that. The insurance information was taken care of. And so I could continue, but I had to go with a new therapist because the old therapist did not accept Medicare. So I started working with a group out of Lexington. The therapist I got was incredible, okay? She was compassionate and concerned, but to a large degree, she was a no-nonsense person, which is exactly what I needed. Exactly what I needed. I didn't need someone who would say, oh, poor Bill. Yeah, you're going through this. And I needed someone who would say, yes, I understand. I feel your pain, but let's look at what reality is. And she would take me through these scenarios, Robert. She would say, well, so what would happen if you lost your job? And I said, well, we've got some savings. Okay, so you wouldn't be homeless then, right? Well, no, not yet, to me. And she said, at that time, Verly was still working full time. She said, well, your wife's still working. Okay, so she helped me, and she used what's called cognitive behavioral therapy to begin to see things that were the reality, okay? But I was still beginning to continue to spiral down and down and down. You all are aware, there were several times that we were in church and I would break down in the front, or when we were on COVID, I had a massive breakdown. And when I was talking about some of the people that I'd hurt and some of the people that had hurt me, and it spiraled down and down and down. And again, one of the things I want to stress is I'm going to be talking openly and honestly about issues of suicide. And Dustin's going to share some resources with you if you or a friend is experiencing that. I decided I was going to take my own life. I'd made a decision, and I came up with a plan. I did not want my family to go through the embarrassment of, here's Bill, he's an elder in his church, he's a Christian, and yet his mental health was so bad that he killed himself. So I'd still made a plan, but I didn't want my family to be embarrassed. And here's what I'll show you. It was a detailed plan, and this is important for you to know. My plan was I was going to go out on the interstate. We were starting to come back into school at that time. I was going to go out on the interstate. Robert, at that time, I was still carrying somewhere in here this knife with me, and I was going to pull off on the side of the interstate, and I was going to put the knife into the tire. And I'd start changing the tire. And then when it came time to pull the tire off, I'd pull it off and tumble out in front of a semi. Hey, law enforcement comes, says he was clumsy, he stumbled out, accidental death. That way I was insured that Verley would get my life insurance policy if there was any riders against suicide in the insurance policy, because I didn't know. Robert, there were other times, so you mentioned this, and Robert did an awesome job with his sermon today. There were other times when every single night I really did truly pray. I want to go to sleep, Lord. This is too much. I'm hurting too bad. Bad things are going to happen, and I don't want to be here when they happen. And so, I had struck rock bottom. So why did I not go through that plan of suicide? I had a plan. I knew when I was going to do it, and it was very detailed. As Dustin will share with you in a little bit, the more detailed the plan, the greater the risk. Now, unbeknownst to me at this time, now, obviously, I'm a son of Kentucky. I'm a son of the South. We like our firearms, and I had several in the house. Verley and Dustin had removed the firearms from the house. I hadn't ever planned on doing anything with them, just simply because of two things. Number one, really messy, okay? Number two, what if I missed? What if I missed? Okay? But I was very much appreciative of that they had done that. And I never, ever, ever asked them, where'd you put them? Even to this day, I have no idea, because why? I'm not cured of anxiety. It's just under control. There's a good possibility that I may go through something similar in the future. And if that happens, I want them to do the exact same thing that they did. So why did I not kill myself? A number of reasons. And I will tell you, I'm sharing this openly and honestly. And you guys are the second group that I'm sharing this with. The first group was my students yesterday. I shared it with them. Why? The number one killer amongst people in public safety is not line of duty deaths. It's suicide. First responders see and experience so much in their in their life. And I attribute part of that to me because I've seen a lot that they ultimately take their lives. Only about 3 weeks ago, 22-year-old EMT that worked for a county that we utilize for our ride site just outside of Lexington did just that. She took her own life. And so what I want to do is I want to take the stigma away from this. Robert, you're a diabetic. Nobody thinks less of you because you're a diabetic. Verley's had breast cancer. Nobody thinks less of Verley because she's had breast cancer. Well, I want to be that person that goes around and tells people, I have mental illness, and you should not think less of me, and especially in the Christian realm. So what happened? Well, first of all, I had an incredibly loving and supportive family. My wife told me, Bill, you're going to get better. I didn't believe her, and I didn't believe God. But somewhere there was a tiny thread that allowed me to hold on to her belief that I was going to get better, that gave me a little glimmer of hope. Okay? The second thing, this church. At no time, now some of y'all may have been thinking, okay, Bill's just living a sinful life. If you thought that, you never said it to me. You never said it to me. Several of you came up to me and shared with me, Hey, I suffer from depression. You know, my kids ate McDonald's for months, and I've been on antidepressants, and I have seen counselors, but no one at any point in time did this church show me anything but love and acceptance. That's the kind of church that Christ wants us to be. So what happened? I don't know. I will tell you, when I started this journey, and this journey lasted 4 years, the 4 worst years of my life. A lot of Vietnam veterans will tell you they have kind of a saying amongst them. It says, I know I'm going to heaven because I've already spent my time in hell in Vietnam. I know I'm going to heaven because Jesus loves me. But Verlie herself would say, sometimes we go through our own times of trouble before the big time of trouble. And I thought, well, I've been there, done that, got the scars. The medicine that I was on, I was taking Paxil, 40 milligrams a day. My doctor said, well, after a while, and I had been on Paxil for 20 years or more. He said, sometimes the medicine begins to wear off, so let's try you on this medicine. Well, we tried this medicine and this medicine and this medicine and this medicine, and nothing worked. Nothing worked with the exception of a little white pill called Klonopin. Klonopin, Judy, as you would know, is a benzodiazepine. Same class, same family of medicine as Valium. I could take that and it would get me through the day. I could function, just barely, but I can function. Here's the problem. The normal prescription for a person on anxiety who is taking a benzo, usually Klonopin or Xanax, something along that line, is 2 weeks. Okay? Because it's very addicting. You become dependent upon it. I was on it for 3 years. 3 years. Not taking the same dose every day, but some days taking up to a 0.5 milligram 3 times a day. Which led me to another worry. If I ever get better, what about the withdrawal? Part of the problem with being a medical person is you just know too much. And what you don't know, you know where to go find information. So I started researching benzo withdrawal. And what I read were horror stories of people that went through withdrawal for years after they had weaned off of what they were taking. But as Verlie said, do you need the medicine? Well, yeah, I did. And so I continued to take it. A year ago, last December, Dustin had come home and we were out at the European Bakery. You know where it is. If you want really, really good baked items that rises to the level of what these two ladies make, but you don't want to make it, go to the European Bakery out in Brandon Crossing. Oh man, it's awesome. We were standing there and we were waiting. This lady got this big, tall cake that was like, huge icing and everything, and it had some strawberries on top. And she made some remark about the cake, and I said, yeah, but it's got fruit on top, therefore it's a health food. And all of a sudden, a light bulb went on in my head, Judy. I had made a joke. I hadn't made a joke for 4 years. I had not felt like I had laughed for 4 years. And suddenly I began to realize I was getting better. There was still the problem of the Klonopin. What do I do? So I talked to my psychiatrist, and he said, I love this guy. He was basically, how are you doing? Okay, are you doing okay? Well, I'm doing about the same. What do you need? Okay, do we need to adjust your medicine? And then the visit was over. I had a counselor for counseling, but he was there for medication. He said, well, let's try this. He said, let's cut your dose down over the course of 2 weeks, step by step. And he said, if you start having withdrawal symptoms, go back up to the previous dose. I said, okay, that sounds good. I was preparing myself for the worst. But after 2 weeks from that date, a year ago in December, I stopped Klonopin and had 0 withdrawal symptoms. None. 0. And as I told my students yesterday, I attribute that to the fact that I have a God that loves me so much that he knew that I could not handle going through withdrawal. Folks, that just typically doesn't happen. The progression began to get better, and I'm back to whatever normal is for me today. I am so grateful for what you did for me to help me get through this. I'm so grateful for my family that helped me to get through this, because too many times within the church, it's kind of like, well, just shake it off. What have you got to be depressed about? What have you got to be anxious about? I had nothing. I had a solid wife, solid relationship with the Lord, solid job that I had loved, and things were going well. My career was just spiking upwards. I had been asked to co-direct the development and the revision of the standards and the guidelines that determines what all levels of EMS responders have to study. So I was going to have direct input for the next probably 10 years or more of what EMTs, paramedics are going to have to learn. And I had to step away from that. I had to step away because I could not attend. So today I'm back to where I'm at now. My class that I've got right now I tease them, because I like to say, I said, well, you're in my top 10 class, and the next week I'll tell them, you're in my top 50 class, and then, you're in my top 30 class or whatever. But realistically, they're probably one of my top 2 classes, because they are just so much fun to be around. Teaching is fun again, and to a large part for these students, because of these students. And again, what made the difference? Because guess what medicine I'm on today? Paxil. The same medicine that had stopped working when I started this journey downward. Same medicine, same dose. Why is it working now and it didn't work then? I don't know. I'm not doing any counseling now because, like I told my counselor when we decided I've come to a point where I'm okay, you have sick people that you need to deal with. So I'm okay. Are there times that I don't get or that I don't have anxiety? No, there are times I'll look at things and it'll come back. It's kind of like, yep, you're going to lose everything. We're in a kind of a transition now, and so sometimes Satan comes back and he hits you yeah, you're going to lose everything. You're going to wind up homeless. But I've seen enough of what God has done for me in the past that I can hold on to that right now and move into the future. Does this mean that I'm never going to go through an episode like that? I certainly hope so. But I have no guarantees. But here's the things that I know. Number one, I have a God that loves me. And I have been so appreciative of Pastor John on his emphasis of that agape love that Christ has that is outward towards us, and he wants us to be the same way towards others. So I know I have a Father that loves me. I know I have a family that will accept me no matter what. And I got a church family that's got my back. All 3 of those things, along with the counseling, along with the medication, is why I am still alive today. So now what I want to do is I want to turn it over to Dustin. As I said, she's an expert in this area. And we did kind of a preview yesterday with my students. And so hopefully they won't be as mean to you as my students were. No, they weren't. So I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Okay. So he always says that was a 4-year ordeal. I say it was much more than that. It took that long for it to become an ordeal. But one of the things that when we look at mental health, we look at lifespan. We look at what's called, and I encourage you, if you're one that likes to learn a little bit more on mental health and development, it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And you can find it at Pace's Connection. But what it is it looks at how does exposure to household dysfunction, addiction, and abuse and neglect impact kids and adults. And what they found is actually, if you've experienced some of those events, there are 10 major ones they've identified within abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, such as a parent incarcerated, a parent addicted to substances, or other abuse in the home. You're at a higher likelihood of heart disease, diabetes, stroke, your own addiction, all of those things. And what I know of my dad's growing up is that he hit a number of those before he hit 18. So there's already some vulnerability in place, and we want to look at those risk factors. We look at that, and one of the things that I also will ask groups, knowing that little snippet of how adverse events can put kids and adults at a vulnerability, think about Christ, think about Jesus. He was conceived in a way that those church ladies were talking about Mary. He was conceived in a way she was already viewed probably as a bit of a pariah. And then you gotta go travel while you're at term. That sounds lovely. And you can't find housing. That's still stressful no matter who you are. And if Christ was made just like us, he was human, his stress response was going to respond to his mother's stress responses. He was going to be influenced by that. And so for 4 years, you experienced what finally came to the surface and became overwhelming for your system. But it took a lifetime to get there. And so this is where we start to look at mental health, and sometimes we put value judgments, but as you start to study the Bible and recognize even Jesus was vulnerable to trauma, you run for your life enough times, it starts to wear on you, even when you're God. And so this side of how do we do this? How do we recognize risks? How do we recognize protective factors? Because you have a place in your relationships that you are a protective factor. One of those things that is we start to see that risk or that decompensation, I start to ask clients, who is your tribe? Who do you have? Because what we know is when we're starting to struggle and depression sets in, anxiety sets in, post-traumatic stress, our cognitive ability to think clearly, to problem solve, kind of starts to come down to about a pinpoint focus. You can't see the people helping you. You can't see the options. You just see what you believe is your solution. Is that. And it's about that focused. And so first and foremost, we talk risk. How do I know if someone's at risk, myself included? Because I know statistically, even in our group, there is depression present, anxiety, trauma, and abuse, just statistically in this room alone. And so we always work off the assumption that folks are hurting, whether it's us or we want to be support to those in the room. Noticing what kind of moods. A mood, an emotion, the chemical makeup of emotions lasts about 15 to 90 seconds. The story we connect with that emotion is what keeps that fueling and rolling on a typical day. We're not talking about mood disorder or a diagnosis that a little different adventure. But on a typical day, and so the first and foremost is, how do you talk to yourself? How do you talk about what's happening around you, or that person sitting next to you, or that interaction? Because that's part of that flooding of our systems. That's part of that process that can come into play. The other part is, do you notice some changes? You may not notice them in yourself. You may notice them in other people. Sleeping more, sleeping less. Eating more, eating less. Concentration. Now, we talked to students yesterday. Concentration, eating, and sleep are a whole different dynamic when you're a student, which is why students are at a higher vulnerability rate. Because when we're not sleeping, not eating regularly, not eating consistently or in a healthy manner to get nutrients that we need, our body's going to suffer, which means our mind is going to suffer. When you're looking through, are you more impulsive? Those risk seekers, doing things that are more impulsive, can sometimes be just simply an impulsivity. Other times it may be an act of suicide attempt. And so we start to look at that, of how does that influence us? The other things that we start to say is, how isolated? How much pulling back is that person doing, or am I doing? Because we're not meant to be in isolation. That's why COVID has left such a huge mark on kids' mental health and older adults' mental health. It's also why it's used as a punishment in prison. Isolation kills. We're not designed for that. And so when we look at the risk factors, there are many, many more. I can pack this is a semester class. But there are many more. And some of the things that I would encourage as a church, as just simply a human, get trained on how to notice signs of suicide, but not only suicide, just asking that question. How comfortable are you to look at someone, don't do this to strangers, but look at someone you know, or have a conversation and to say, wow, there's been a lot going on for you. How many times this week have you thought about hurting yourself or killing yourself? It's a really uncomfortable question to ask. But we can ask it that way and reduce that stigma of the fact that life can get to where it looks like this is the only option. Or we can open that conversation, which really does save lives. Now, you can ask it that way, or you can ask it of, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Which immediately tells me what I hope your answer is going to be to me. And we do this, and I'm going to say, teach from young all the way up. Because the 8th leading cause of death for 5 to 11-year-olds now is suicide. And so if little kids want to die, should we not equip little kids to help save lives? That's where churches can be. I've grown up in the Adventist church. I've grown up with this story of how hard life is going to become, or already is. But there's this piece that I didn't get. I might not have been paying attention too hard. But it was that when we go through hard times, our body is designed to protect us. Our brain is designed to survive. And sometimes how that brain has survived doesn't work well forever. Staying in a state of distress or hypervigilance for long term begins to wear on your body. It begins to wear on your brain and becomes toxic, becomes destructive. And so what we start to look at are things along the lines of recognizing what is a tolerable stress, what's a positive stress, such as going to school, such as learning new things or putting on new programs. This can't be the least stressful thing in your life. But then looking at when does it move from positive or a tolerable stressor, which when we have buffers, people to lean on, faith to recognize, that's a tolerable. I can get through this. When it moves into toxic, where it's destructive. This is where we want to start to look at how do we build connections. It's a preventative factor right there, and the treatment. I worked on mobile crisis or crisis response to jails and hospitals or homes a lot. And that was my first question when we were safety planning. Who do you call when you're having a bad day? Who do you call when you feel unsafe? Connections, build those. Keep looking for where you can build them in your community, in your life. It doesn't have to be a big program. It can be simply talking, communicating, and sharing what you've learned. The other element is looking at how do you simply embed this into daily life. Some of those preventatives or treatments. Recognize your history. I'm blessed with heart disease. What else is in our family? Kidney disease, cancer. I already know that's in my family history. Addiction. I know it's in there. I also know, it's a funny thing, heard it somewhere, 3 generations. It takes 3 generations to reduce the vulnerability for addiction in a family. Sins of our fathers' fathers. I think I've heard that somewhere. Yep. And so we see that where also trauma influences how generations engage in life. If you want a fun study, looking at the Dutch famine study of where nutrients impacted, because while your mom was being formed, your egg was being formed. And so this is why it's not just simply think about happy things, you'll feel better. It's a truly embedded process. And then how it is expressed is a complicated process. Yet we see it continuing to be proven now. What we've heard many, many years through the Bible, science is finally catching. And to say, oh yeah, it does take 3 and 4 generations to get the vulnerability factor out, which is part of the reasons I chose not to try substances, because I knew that my grandparents had that. I knew the vulnerability was still high. Teaching people about the adverse childhood study, doing things like this for a community. The other side is parents are really stressed, y'all. I don't feel like I need to say that as the single person in this room. But where can you step in the gap to support families, support stressed out parents? Because when we get stressed out, our own decision-making capacity reduces. We really get decision fatigue. That's for our own care and our family's care. The other is looking at what are resiliency practices that you have to cultivate. Robert, I loved the illustration today of just enough flour, just enough oil for that day. Because we tend to like to think, look, I ate all my spinach. Can't I feel better now? Can I lose weight now? Can I feel healthier now? Because I had that one meal like 3 weeks ago. But it is a daily practice, and it is not simply think about happy things. It is a fierce process where sometimes it is a matter of just simply getting up is a marathon and something to be celebrated. Recognizing what are your assumptions of what mental illness, what mental health and well-being looks like. More often, it's shocking to people when comedians or entertainers, such as Robin Williams or recent death by Twitch, they seem so happy. But this is a process that can occur in a blink of an eye when we engage in that. And so recognizing, talking about it, and then shifting your perspective from one that's pretty common of, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get it together? To one of, what happened to you? That this was your coping. What happened? What's your story? That this is how you've survived. I have a running joke that social workers can make any behavior strengths-based. And some people will test us on that. But anything that can become a strengths-based, it really is a practice of shifting that. Because if a client comes in, and it is a client who maybe bothers me a little bit and is difficult to deal with, it's my job to like them, not make them like me, as the one in that position of power, as a treating therapist. It's my job to learn to like those around me, not their job to make me like them. That's a resiliency practice, to be able to shift it of, what happened that caused you to engage with life this way? Do I love it? No. But if I'm angry at you, I'm inflaming my own system and staying agitated and maybe causing some of the conflict myself. And so that's simply a shift, a framing shift, that if I'm asking what happened to you, it takes it from a worth or a blaming stance and shifts that stigma, because nothing's wrong with you. Life happened to you. The other is how many resources are in your community. One of the things that I highly recommend is, if you use a cell phone or have that, put those numbers in, because it's very easy to say, hey, you're really struggling. Why don't we call right now? And you can call 988 if it's an emergency, if it's an emergency and someone is in dire need, you call 911 all the time, even mental health issues. But 988 was the shift to from a really long hotline number to 3 numbers as well. And so you can call, you do not have to be in crisis, but you can call. Usually it's routed to your local community mental health. But having this in your phone, or having the crisis text line, so if you don't like to call, you can use a text line. Having it on hand is a little easier than saying, well, hold on, let me look up the resources. Hold on, I don't know how to do it yet. You have to do some practice ahead of time, just like asking the question of, are you thinking of hurting or killing yourself? Take some practice, because it's very uncomfortable to ask if it's not something that you ask on a regular basis. The other is looking at, what are your local hotlines? What's called a warm line. A warm line is, you can just talk to a person. I need to talk to someone. I'm not really in crisis, but I just need to talk. And through COVID, more warm lines actually became staffed, because people recognized, I need some connection. The phone also is a really cool tool. I hate talking on the phone. However, one of the things I noticed when I talked to people on the phone instead of telehealth during COVID is they would get very deep, very fast, because they weren't watching for my reaction. They weren't worried about, if I tell you this, you're going to have a look on your face. And so they had the freedom to talk and not have to manage my reaction. And so this is where, if people like to talk on the phone or having that connection with others, you can do that in your church. You can check on each other that way. And then there's something called a friendship line. And this is for aging individuals, actually, because what we know is that suicide, death by suicide, the highest rate is actually in older adults. Because as my friendship group is reducing and isolation grows, isolation kills, life feels less and less hopeful. And so the friendship line, that one is from the Institute on Aging, and it is literally that. I can call and just chat with you. We're just going to chat. There is no purpose. There is not treatment. It's not therapy. But it's also, I have a few students who have started volunteering because they said, this is kind of fun. I just get to chat with people on the phone. And it's really kind of cool to hear stories. And so it's bringing intergenerational. Young are learning from older, and older are sharing with younger. And so that feeling of purpose. But it's saving lives too. So there's a couple of resources that churches are perfectly poised to continue to help. If you do like to read books, I'll email someone lots of resources. But there are a few, and one is called The Body Keeps the Score. This is not light reading. This is typically used for textbooks. It's not a textbook, but it is heavier reading. But Bessel van der Kolk is a researcher and author very much on trauma and then looking at trauma-informed responses. Because if we aren't able to metabolize the stress and the crisis and some of the events that we go through, our body has to deal with it somehow because we're made that way. We're designed to be able to respond to our environment. I do think this is one of those cool ways that God flexed with a sinful world. But if we don't deal with it, it continues to wear on us. And another, it's called The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And she talks about the adverse childhood experiences and some of her work that she's done with it in California. And it's just, she's a great story. That one, that's a good book to read through, a little less textbook, but beautiful in illustrating. What can we do? How do we shift this? If anything, it's a day-by-day process. Not a quick fix, and it's a community process. So as we look through it, one of the things I would encourage for your church to look and go, well, what can we do in this arena? We know that life continues to get more and more stressful, and after COVID, that seems to have kicked in a higher notch of distress, crisis, and crisis calls have gone amazingly high for hotlines and crisis teams. I think churches are the element of where can you step in that gap to literally meet a need and a mental health life-saving skill. Some of that may be in training for suicide prevention. There are a couple of good programs you can get trained in on, and holding the trainings here, but also looking in your community of who do we need to share this with? How do we support this? Because young kids are probably more bold at saying, "Are you okay?" than we are at times. And that "are you okay?" is all that's needed for someone to say, "Nope, I'm not." So, questions that you might have that I didn't cover through here. Mental health and wellness is a wide gamut, so questions that you might have. Yeah.
Wondering about the cutters.
Okay, so self-harm, intentional self-harm. That's another area where I would say we could do a whole semester's worth. But one of the things that I tell people when we're looking at folks who do self-harm, and even those that have suicide attempts, when we frame it through, this is how I'm trying to cope. There is some science behind intentional or self-harming of how that actually kicks your body into some different coping, also some of the ritualistic that comes into it. We tend to look at safety planning. Now, again, getting connected with a counselor, I always tell people interview your counselors. The first one you get, if it's not a good fit, you can look for another one. It's a job interview for them too. And so that's the part of looking at how do we look at safety planning appropriately? What is our response when you do use self-harm? And how do we not shame you? Because you cannot shame someone so far into healing. And so we don't want to perpetuate that cycle either. But it really is looking at safety planning and then, hey, what else can we try? What else can we do? How do we start to build that open acceptance with continuing to move you towards something that it isn't going to get in the way of your life or your safety? Yeah. Here and then here.
So why do people cut themselves, especially kids that go through cutting?
Oh, that's a lot of different answers, actually. But what I would say is ask that person. So when the question is, why would you self-harm? Why would you do that? And it could be many different things. It could be that I'm using this as basically I'm punishing myself. It could be I am trying to survive, and this is what grounds me. This is what takes me out of my head, because pain suddenly shifts our body. Now we can do added skills in place. The other thing that also shifts your body pretty quick is put your hands in some ice water and see how long you can hold them there, and then pull them out, and that process. But some of it could be that. I've heard many different reasons. And staying curious about, how does this help you? And sometimes people will say it doesn't. That's why I'm here. And I know they're ready to then start working toward replacing it. Others will say, well, it's because of this, and this. And it keeps me safe. And so it's really an interesting thing. This is where I like mental health, because it's very individualized. And we have to recognize that it is individualized, where that story and how that serves a purpose may look different for different people. But when we don't, the challenge, and I like that you asked that, of why, the challenge for us is if it isn't our struggle, it seems foreign. And we run the risk, okay, I'll own it. I run the risk of going, well, why do you do that? That's weird. Because we don't know it. We don't know the pain. We don't know the process. We don't know how it serves. But here I've got my pet coping style that others probably look at and go, well, that's weird. Okay? I wouldn't do it. So we have to be very careful of just staying curious of, how does that help you? How does that serve a purpose? Because that's usually where we start to learn more of that story of what happened to you. It's a good question. Yeah. Hang on.
For people who have like autism,
Mhm.
and then this depression comes into, how do you help them specifically with their other disorder?
So that's where you definitely partner. It depends how intensely impacted folks are on that autism spectrum. But that's also the fun part of working and partnering with someone to say, what works for you? What doesn't work for you? We might have to get a little more creative with how this is. I had a student, I worked with a behavioral classroom. And so these are the K to third graders who are getting kicked out because they're already beating teachers up. They're already throwing things, destroying classrooms. They're struggling. And all of them had experienced quite a bit of trauma before school age. And one young lady, she wasn't in our classroom, but she was on the spectrum. And we would know what kind of day it was going to be depending on her laugh. Because if it was high and excited and shrill, we were like, okay, we're on it. We're on point. This is good. But if it hit this other tone, everybody was kind of like, okay, keep an eye out. We're going to have to back the teachers up just to help support. And she knew where she wanted to go. She had a plan. It just was, we knew, okay, it might be a harder day. Now that no words ever were exchanged, but we could tell because we knew, and we'd been working with her family. And so this is the part where I love about working with folks on the spectrum, is you have to get creative and start to explore a little bit, because depression may present differently. Depression presents very different for young kids. And so recognizing that it's not just sad tears and sitting in one place. It can look like anger, nightmare, hypervigilance, of, those kids where you're just like, would you just sit? But they're watching the room because they're making sure everyone's safe. But we just think, oh, this is hyper. And so that's that part when you're looking on the spectrum of definitely learning what are your skills, what are your strengths, and what are you either avert, that's the fun part. One more? Okay. I got the one. Make it a good one.
Well, I have a question, but how do I say this? I thank you for your comment about looking back to when your childhood, things happened in your childhood, and kind of giving us permission as adults to say, hey, you're not a child anymore, but you're still carrying all that stuff from childhood forward.
Mhm.
And some of this trauma that came to us as children came to the whole family. And it's interesting to see how each member of that family has kind of dealt with it a little differently. Some would like to say, this thing never existed. I only remember the good things of my childhood. And then some people, it seems, they only focus on the negative thing. And it creates kind of a weird family dynamic. I don't know that there's a question there, but I wish we could give ourselves permission to say, we're adults, I'm in my 60s, but still inside of me, some parts of me are still a kid, right? Still
Yep.
dealing with that thing.
And that's that process of how do we talk to ourselves about those events? And there's a term that I often will tell people of, don't forget there's a term called post-traumatic growth. And I tend to look at this because as our family growing up, I experienced watching several suicide attempts. My parents, I can sleep anywhere because I've been in and out of hospitals with them. And it's this process of, I went into the mental health field and suicide prevention is one of my passion areas. And trauma and adoption, I've worked a lot with all of that area. And so looking back at some of that exposure to trauma, and I often would say, well, nothing really bad happened to me. But what we also know is actually people who witness either the physical abuse or tragic are at a greater risk because it's this sense of I watched and I couldn't do anything. And so it is worse than being the recipient of that. And so recognizing it, but also recognizing this is, again, that element of we are in a sinful world and we have a God who still can handle this, where post-traumatic growth is that growth past healing. And just like in bone, in muscle, when there is a repair, it can be stronger and then used forward, because that's that element of there is always hope. Sometimes we have to hold it for that person until they can see it. All right, let's bow our heads and then I'll let you guys go. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much. Thank you for every person in this room. Thank you for that you are a God who can use whatever has happened. You are a God who knows what will happen and you can handle it. I pray that you'll just guide and lead this church and every ministry in here and provide wisdom as they move forward, no matter what they are faced with. In your name, amen.